Movies made Doc Holliday look sharp, clever, and almost mythical. But the real man was far messier, far more dangerous, and in some ways, far worse than the version most people know from the screen. Once you move past the famous quotes and the Hollywood gunfights, a darker pattern starts to show. This is the side of Doc Holliday the movies usually soften, skip, or completely leave out. Number 1. The Mask. What the movies usually do with Doc Holliday is give him a kind of clean darkness. They make him dangerous, but in a polished way. He gets the sharp one-liners, the cool stare, the sense that even when he is violent, there is some higher purpose behind it. The real Doc Holliday feels rougher than that. Not because the historical record proves every wild story people told about him, and not because every legend about his kill count stands up. A lot of those stories do not. The harder truth is that once you strip away the myth, you are still left with a man who made ordinary situations feel one bad sentence away from gunfire. That is a different kind of danger. It is less cinematic, but it is also more disturbing. In the real Old West, men like Holliday did not move through life as isolated duelists waiting for one perfect showdown. They lived in saloons, gambling rooms, hotel corridors, back lots, and train platforms. They argued over money, over insults, over loyalty, over who had backed down the night before, over who was carrying a weapon when local law said they should not be. That means the real Doc was not dangerous only in big, famous moments. He was dangerous in the small ones, too. And that is exactly where film versions usually soften him. They make him seem selective. The record suggests something harsher. He could be funny, quick, intelligent, and loyal to certain people. But he also had a pattern that shows up again and again. High tension, quick escalation, and a willingness to let fear do part of the work for him. In other words, the real problem with Doc Holliday was not simply that he could shoot. It was that he lived in a way that kept violence close at hand all the time. People often talk about him as though the key fact is that he was a sick man with a gun. That is too simple. Plenty of sick men are not feared across multiple towns. The reason Holliday stayed feared was that he understood how reputation worked in the West, especially in gambling culture. He knew a name could be a weapon. He knew that if people believed you were capable of anything, they might stop short before testing you. So when we say Doc Holliday was worse than the movies show, the point is not that Hollywood made him too brave or too deadly. The point is that Hollywood made him too neat. Real men in that world were not neat. Holliday sat in the space between lawman and outlaw, between friend and menace, between self-defense and provocation. That gray area is where his real story becomes a lot darker. Because once you look at the record, you do not just see a tragic gunfighter. You see someone who kept turning rooms, arguments, and grudges into places where people had to think about dying. Number 2. The reputation. That darker version starts with something many movie scenes hint at, but rarely explain properly. Fear was part of the job. Holliday spent years in gambling rooms, and gambling in the Old West was not some side detail. It was one of the fastest ways to make money in boom towns full of miners, drifters, cowboys, soldiers, freight men, and hard drinkers. It also meant sitting within arm's reach of angry losers, cheats, drunks, and men carrying weapons. A professional gambler was not protected by modern law, cameras, or a security team. He was protected by his nerve, his read of the room, and his reputation. That mattered even more for Holliday because he was not physically imposing in the usual way. He was thin, sick, and living with tuberculosis. A healthy, broad-shouldered brawler might survive by trusting his body in a close fight. Holliday could not rely on that. So he leaned hard on something else. He learned that being thought of as reckless, deadly, and a little unstable could serve as armor. A man who seemed capable of sudden violence was less likely to be grabbed, rushed, or openly challenged. That does not make him some master strategist calmly playing chess while everyone else played checkers. It makes him more unsettling than that. It means his image and his temper fed each other. Once people saw him as dangerous, he had an incentive not to weaken that image. Once he understood the value of a feared name, it became useful to let stories grow. That is one reason historians today are careful with the giant body count legends attached to him. Some alleged killings are late inventions, some are shaky, and some are probably the result of later writers stacking rumor on rumor. But even if those stories were inflated, they were inflated around a real center of menace. Holliday did not need to have killed every man later credited to him for the reputation to work. He just needed enough people to think testing him was a bad idea. And that leads to another difference between real life and the movies. Film often presents reputation as the reward for a hero's actions. In Holliday's world, reputation could be an active tool. It could be cultivated, protected, and used. That makes his presence feel less romantic. The popular version says, "Here is a doomed, brilliant, coughing gunfighter whose legend followed him." The sharper version says, "Here is a man who understood that legend itself could be useful, and who had no problem letting it harden into something people would rather not challenge." Once you look at him that way, a lot of his behavior stops looking like random Western chaos and starts looking like a repeated system. Talk hard, insult hard, carry hard, and make sure people believe the next step could be worse than they want to find out. The problem is that a system like that does not stay under control for long. Sooner or later, someone answers back, and when that happened around Holliday, the result was often uglier than the polished movie version. Number 3. The Fuse. One of the clearest examples came in Tombstone before the most famous gunfight ever attached to his name. In October 1880, Holliday got into a dispute at the Oriental Saloon with another gambler, Johnny Tyler. This was not some grand moral clash between frontier good and frontier evil. It was a gambling room fight, the kind of thing that could start with bad blood, insults, or a business dispute, and then turn serious because everyone involved understood how fragile status was in that world. Accounts differ on each small detail, but the broad shape is clear enough. Holliday and Tyler clashed. Holliday either left or was forced out. Then he came back armed. In the chaos that followed, Milt Joyce, one of the men connected to the saloon, was shot in the hand, and another man, Parker, was hit in the toe. Holliday himself was then struck over the head with a pistol. Later, he pleaded guilty to assault and battery and paid a fine. That whole episode matters because it strips away almost every heroic excuse later films like to give him. Nobody needs a slow camera push or dramatic music to understand what it means when a man leaves a gambling fight, returns with a weapon, and starts shooting in a room full of people. That is not a cold, noble showdown. It is not a clean duel. It is volatile, reckless behavior with bystanders close by. And this is where the real Holliday starts to look worse than the screen version.
Movies often frame his violence as controlled.
He may be deadly, but he is usually shown as precise, almost disciplined. Like a man who kills only when the world leaves him no choice. The Oriental saloon incident does not fit that image. It looks like a man whose pride, anger, and need to maintain face could spill over fast. Even more telling is the setting. This was business space, social space, public space. Men were drinking, talking, gambling, moving around. The risk was not limited to the person he was angry at. Anybody standing in the wrong place could get hit. That makes the real event harder to admire. It also tells you something about how Holliday handled humiliation. Some men cool off. Some men circle back with a gun. In the West, that difference mattered. Once a person gets known for coming back armed, every future argument changes shape. Other people start calculating, not just what he might say in the moment, but what he might do 10 minutes later. That is how a reputation turns from rumor into practical fear. By the time Holliday became linked forever to the Earps and the OK Corral story, he had already shown that he did not need a world historical feud to make a room dangerous. Sometimes an insult and a wounded ego were enough. That is important because it helps explain why, when bigger conflicts arrived, a lot of people in Tombstone did not see him as some tragic gentleman caught in events. They saw a hot man with a short fuse and a weapon in easy reach. Number 4. The suspicion. That atmosphere of fear and volatility matters even more when you get to one of the ugliest episodes around Holliday's name in Tombstone: the stage robbery accusation. In March 1881, a stagecoach headed from Tombstone toward Benson was held up. The robbers killed the driver and a passenger and got away with a large sum of money. It was exactly the kind of crime that pushed the town's already ugly tensions even closer to open war. The Earps were hunting one side of the cowboy world. Sheriff Johnny Bean sat on the other side of the local power divide. Holliday was tied to the Earps, hated by their enemies, and already known as a dangerous gambler. Then the story gets dirtier. After a personal blow-up between Holliday and Big Nose Kate, she was reportedly found in a drunk state and gave a statement that tied Holliday to the robbery. Later, the accusation fell apart. Witnesses placed him elsewhere. Kate changed her story. The case collapsed. On paper, that sounds like a point in Holliday's favor, and legally it was. But the reason the episode still belongs in this conversation is that it shows what kind of world he was living in and what kind of reputation he had built. He was the sort of man people could name in a double murder robbery, and enough listeners would pause and think, maybe. That is not because all listeners were fools. It is because Holliday already occupied a space so close to outlaw violence that the accusation sounded plausible before it was proved weak. And once again, that is rougher than the movies. Film usually wants categories you can hold on to: lawman, outlaw, friend, villain. The real West kept wrecking those clean labels. Holliday could ride with men on the law side in one moment, then find himself named in a stage robbery conspiracy the next. He could be guilty of one kind of violent act and innocent of another, and his enemies knew exactly how to use that against him. What makes the whole thing even uglier is the way alcohol, grudges, and private manipulation all fed into the legal process. This was not a world where a clean investigation quietly sorted fact from fiction. It was a world where a sick, hard-drinking gambler with enemies on every side could be dragged into a murder case through rumor, pressure, and a damaged personal relationship. Even when he beat the charge, nothing really became clean again. The accusation deepened the local split. It increased the sense that Holliday was not just a bad-tempered card player, but a man always half a step from organized outlaw violence. So even when he was not the robber, the event still made him look like the kind of person who might be. And that matters, because the worst part of Holliday's image is not that every terrible thing said about him was true. It is that enough of it felt possible to the people around him that almost any dark story could gain traction. Number 5. The push. By the time the OK Corral fight finally happened, the streets of Tombstone were already thick with anger, alcohol, rumor, and wounded pride. The way popular culture tells that story, everything moves toward a clear showdown. The bad men come in, the good men stand up. Doc Holliday, sick but sharp, helps his friends do what has to be done. The real build-up was uglier than that. It included drinking, taunts, threats, side deals, failed attempts to disarm people, and a whole lot of bad judgment by men who seemed unable to stop escalating. Some accounts describe Holliday's late-night encounter with Ike Clanton on October 25th as especially ugly. The language reported in later reconstructions is rough. The insults were personal, and the whole tone was not about calming anything down. It was about pressure. It was about pushing a rival into a corner. Holliday was not acting like a detached man dragged reluctantly toward duty. He was part of the heat. He seems to have wanted Ike Clanton scared and off balance, because once everyone believed blood was coming, every man in the conflict had an excuse for carrying himself like the next minute could explode. That point matters because it changes the emotional structure of the famous gunfight. The movie version loves the idea that Holliday steps in because he is loyal to Wyatt Earp and because someone has to face the cowboy threat. The historical record suggests something less tidy. Loyalty was there, no doubt,
But so was appetite for confrontation. So was provocation. So was the basic fact that Holliday was not a neutral officer of the law, ordered into a dangerous but necessary job. He insisted on being involved in a conflict that was already loaded with private hate. That is exactly the kind of detail Hollywood smooths over. Once a film makes him the witty, doomed friend, it becomes very easy to hide how much he may have contributed to the atmosphere that produced the shooting. Even the broader issue of carrying guns in town was messy. Tombstone had an ordinance against carrying deadly weapons. The cowboys had reason to fear arrest or public humiliation. The Earps had reason to believe armed resistance was possible. Holliday entered that situation not as a calming presence, but as one of the last men you would want near a tense confrontation if your actual goal was to lower the temperature. And real townspeople saw that. That is why questions came quickly after the gunfight about why a man with his temper had been allowed to join the operation in the first place. A lot of the darker truth about Holliday sits right there. He was useful because he was feared, but that also made him dangerous to use. Once you deputize or arm a man like that around a grudge he already shares, you are not just enforcing order. You are carrying your own instability with you into the street. Number 6. The lot. Even the phrase, gunfight at the OK Corral, cleans up what really happened. The shooting did not take place inside some wide, theatrical arena built for a duel. It happened in a narrow, vacant lot near the rear entrance of the corral, hemmed in by buildings and fences, with men packed close together. It lasted less than half a minute. There was no graceful pause, no measured count, no perfect moral geometry. There were conflicting witness statements from the start, confusion over who drew first, disagreement over who was armed, and immediate argument over whether this had been a lawful disarming attempt or a rushed killing. Holliday's role inside that mess is one of the strongest reasons the real story feels harsher than the screen version. He was not there as a simple spectator backing his friends. He was armed and central. At least at the start of the encounter, he was carrying a shotgun, reportedly handed to him by Virgil Earp,
while Virgil took Holliday's walking stick or cane to make the approach look less openly aggressive. That detail alone tells you how tense and tactical the moment was. It also makes the scene feel less noble. This was not just brave men walking forward under a badge. It was a fast, dangerous operation shaped by concealment, fear, and split-second decisions. The actual firing sequence remains debated. Sheriff Behan believed, though not with total certainty, that Holliday may have fired first. Wyatt Earp later testified that Tom McClory fired before Holliday answered with the shotgun. Other witnesses contradicted each other on several points, including whether Tom McClory even had a weapon in hand. But one thing is hard to miss. Holliday's part in the violence was brutally direct. In many reconstructions, he delivered the shotgun blast that mortally wounded Tom McClory at close range. That is not a flourish. That is not stylish pistol work. That is a close-quarter killing in a cramped space, surrounded by men who were all armed, frightened, angry, or all three at once. The movies usually turn that into clarity. Real life leaves it muddy. Maybe that is why the legend keeps pulling people back. People want the scene to line up morally because the raw version is uncomfortable. A law action turns into a bloodbath in seconds. A friend of the law is also a known hothead. A supposed disarming becomes 3 dead men in under 30 seconds.
And Holliday, the man later wrapped in charisma, stands right in the middle of that blur. If you are looking for what makes him worse than the movies show, it is not only the violence itself. It is the way the real event resists easy justification. He can look brave, reckless, necessary, angry, and privately invested all at once. That combination is a lot harder to romanticize once you stop watching it like a classic Western and start seeing it as a compressed burst of chaos, where a man already known for sudden violence was given a central role. Number 7. The hearing. The legal aftermath matters just as much as the shootout itself, because it shows that the question was never as simple as later films make it seem. After the gunfight, Holliday and the Earps were not immediately celebrated and sent on their way as obvious heroes. They faced a long preliminary hearing. Witness after witness came forward. The hearing ran for nearly a month, and around 30 witnesses were examined. That alone should reset the way people think about the event. If everything had been clean, obvious, and universally accepted as lawful self-defense, there would not have been that level of scrutiny. Prosecutors and hostile witnesses were trying to prove murder. Holliday's name was not some decorative extra in the case. He was one of the men whose actions had to be examined under oath. Testimony cut in different directions. Some evidence supported the Earps. Some made the shooting look rash. Some pointed toward Holliday as the likely first man to fire. Wyatt's own account framed the other side as armed and dangerous, and said Holliday fired only after Tom McClory fired. The problem, again, is the lack of clean certainty. Judge Wells Spicer ultimately ruled that the defendants would not face a criminal trial. He concluded that the Earps and Holliday were justified under the circumstances. But even in that favorable ruling, there was an edge. Spicer described Virgil Earp's decision to use his brothers and Doc Holliday in the disarming effort as injudicious and censurable, even though not criminal. That phrase matters. It tells you that even when the law did not convict Holliday, the situation still smelled bad enough that the court could acknowledge serious poor judgment. And local reaction was divided too. Some citizens supported the Earps.
Others asked why a man like Holliday had been brought into the middle of such a dangerous effort at all. That public doubt gets lost in the movies because film likes resolution. Once the shooting is over, the audience wants a verdict on character. The real Tombstone did not get that. It got funerals, testimony, newspaper anger, and a town even more divided than before. In that setting, Holliday was not simply the loyal companion who helped a lawful operation succeed. He was also the hot-blooded gambler many residents already distrusted, now linked forever to one of the most controversial 30 seconds in Western history. And that may actually be worse for his image than a straight outlaw reputation would have been. A pure outlaw fits a simple story. Holliday kept operating in a dirtier zone where a judge could release him, townspeople could still fear him, and the same act could be called lawful, reckless, justified, and provocative, depending on who was speaking. That kind of record does not produce a clean legend. It produces a man who seemed to drag legal trouble and moral confusion in behind him wherever he went. Number 8. The Ringo Story. Another place where Hollywood quietly improves Doc Holliday is the Johnny Ringo story. A lot of viewers carry around the image from the 1993 film Tombstone, the spinning tin cup, the strange calm, the final dramatic duel in the dark. It is memorable cinema, but it is not history. Even the National Park Service has pointed out that those scenes are strictly Hollywood. Real life was messier and less elegant.
Holliday and Ringo did have a real hostility. They were part of overlapping circles of violence and reputation in southern Arizona, and there was genuine danger in that rivalry. Men around them understood that both could be willing to shoot. But the legendary one-on-one final duel does not hold up. What the record suggests instead is a series of tense confrontations, threats, public performances of nerve, and interrupted chances for bloodshed rather than one clean showdown that decides everything. In January 1882, there was a well-known face-off in Tombstone where Holliday and Ringo were reportedly ready for violence until officers and bystanders stepped in and stopped it. That alone tells you something useful. The real men did not need a moonlit, formal duel to be dangerous. They were perfectly capable of turning a public street into a live problem with no audience-friendly structure at all. Later, when Ringo was found dead, the official verdict was suicide. The idea that Holliday secretly rode out and outdrew him makes for better mythology, but it also makes the whole story more honorable than the truth. A duel gives shape to violence. It makes it look like skill, courage, and fate. The real version is rougher. You have a man like Holliday, carrying grudges across weeks and months, ready to fight, stopped only because somebody else got in the way, and then a rival whose death later gets swallowed into legend, whether or not the evidence supports that link. In other words, the myth does two things at once. It exaggerates Holliday's role in a dramatic way, but it also sanitizes the emotional ugliness of what was really going on. Real hostility in the Old West was not always resolved in fair contests. Sometimes it sat there like poison in the town, with everyone knowing two men wanted to kill each other, and nobody able to say exactly when it would happen. That ongoing threat is harder to film than a duel, but it may be a better picture of the real Holliday. He was not just dangerous in single, perfect moments. He was dangerous as a continuing presence. He could keep a grudge alive, feed it, talk through it, and push it toward violence without ever giving history the neat ending later storytellers wanted. That makes him feel less like a romantic rival and more like a man whose very existence kept tension active around him. Number 9. The Rage. That pattern gets even darker after Morgan Earp was murdered in March 1882.
This is where the popular image of Holliday as the loyal friend becomes most tempting. Because there is no question he was close to Wyatt Earp and deeply tied to the Earp side of the conflict. But loyalty does not make the next part pretty. After Morgan was killed and Virgil had already been badly wounded in an earlier ambush, the situation moved from tension into raw vendetta. Accounts from the period and later reconstructions describe Holliday in a state of open fury. He reportedly vowed to kill the men responsible and went through town kicking in doors while looking for them. Whether every dramatic detail was captured perfectly or not, the broad point is hard to avoid. This was not a calm, legal response. This was rage, moving through a town already on edge. That matters because movies usually frame revenge in a very direct way. A loved one is killed. The surviving men take action. The audience understands the motive and is guided toward approval. The historical reality was uglier because law and revenge blurred together. Wyatt Earp was a deputy U.S. Marshal. Holliday was tied to him and to his circle. A federal badge and a private blood feud were now traveling side by side. That is a dangerous mixture in any era, and in the Old West, it could turn deadly fast. Holliday fit into that moment almost too well. He was already armed, already feared, already angry, already convinced that intimidation and deadly force were practical tools.
So when the Earp vendetta phase begins, he does not look like a reluctant helper who simply got swept along by events. He looks like exactly the kind of man who would step easily from lawful posse work into personal retribution. Again, that does not mean every later story told about the vendetta is equally solid. The problem is deeper than that. The confirmed outline is enough. Men were hunted, shots were fired. The split between official authority and private vengeance got thinner and thinner. Holliday's presence inside that blur is one reason historians keep stressing complexity, while movies keep leaning toward legend. The cinematic version likes the feeling that the right men are finally doing what the law cannot. The real version leaves you with armed men who were grieving, furious, legally connected, and personally invested, making life and death decisions in a climate where almost everyone expected the worst. Holliday did not just inhabit that climate. He amplified it. He was the kind of ally who made retaliation easier to imagine and easier to carry out. That may be admirable to some viewers in fiction. In history, it is one more reason he can look rougher than the screen version, because real vengeance does not arrive wrapped in a heroic score. It arrives with anger, fear, confusion, and men who have already proved they can turn a grudge into gunfire. Number 10. The Station. One of the clearest examples of that darker vendetta reality is the killing of Frank Stillwell at the Tucson train station. This was not a classic frontier showdown staged at high noon. It was a hunt. After Morgan Earp's murder, Wyatt Earp and his allies escorted Virgil and his wife toward safety by rail. Frank Stillwell, who had his own history in the conflict, was seen in Tucson near the station. Wyatt later claimed Stillwell was part of an ambush plot. What happened next became one of the most notorious revenge killings in the whole Earp story. Witnesses placed armed members of the Earp party near the depot, and one account described Holliday getting off the train carrying shotguns. Stillwell was soon found dead, hit by shotgun pellets and bullets. Warrants were issued afterward for Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and others. That sequence matters because it destroys the comforting version of Holliday as merely the witty side character standing beside history while bigger men shape it. In Tucson, Holliday was not just nearby. He was part of a group moving toward deadly reprisal in a public place where civilians were present, trains were arriving,
and events could spiral without warning. Whatever someone thinks about Stillwell's guilt, the method still matters. This was not the law slowly closing in after a full investigation. It was armed men settling a score under the shadow of legal authority, but outside any calm courtroom process. And that is where the real Holliday looks especially harsh. He had already spent years proving that he could live in exactly this space, the one where a personal enemy, a public confrontation, and loaded weapons all come together in seconds. The train station killing also shows how far the image of Holliday had moved from anything like normal civic life. By this point, he was a man associated not just with a famous gunfight or a saloon shooting, but with armed movement across territories, warrants, and retaliatory killings. That is much closer to the reality of a hunted figure than the polished image films often give him. The movie version can make a revenge scene feel like justice catching up. The historical version keeps pulling you back to the same harder question. What kind of man keeps ending up where private hate, public force, and sudden killing overlap? The answer with Holliday is not that he was misunderstood. It is that he was unusually fitted to that world. He was useful in moments when men wanted someone at their side who would not hesitate.
But a man who does not hesitate is not easy to contain once the shooting starts. Tucson makes that plain. By then, Holliday was not just surviving violence. He was moving with it, and the law itself was starting to move against him. Number 11. The Flight. Once warrants followed the vendetta killings, Holliday's life looked a lot less like the legend of a tragic Western knight, and a lot more like the reality of a man slipping through networks of friendship, jurisdiction, and reputation. He and the Earp party left Arizona and moved toward Colorado. That move is often told quickly, almost like a montage between dramatic scenes, but it says a lot about who Holliday really was by that stage. He was not simply the loyal companion who had helped justice and then faded quietly into the mountains. He was a man connected to killings serious enough that Arizona authorities wanted him brought back. What stopped that from happening was not some universal agreement that he had done nothing wrong. It was the messy fact of Western politics, local loyalties, and personal influence. Extradition efforts stalled. Colorado's governor refused to send the men back. Bat Masterson and other allies were part of the environment that made Colorado safer ground than Arizona. That is not the ending of a clean hero's chapter. It is the survival pattern of a man who could move between lawmen and wanted status, depending on where he stood and who was standing beside him. And that double position is central to why the real Holliday feels harsher than the screen version. Movies love him because he is dramatic but still emotionally readable. He is usually the doomed friend, the brilliant sidearm, the man dying young but going out with style. The actual Holliday after Tucson looks much less controlled. He looks like someone living on reputation, loyalty, and legal gray space. Someone who could not safely return to the place where his name was now tied to escalating revenge killings. That is not a poetic decline. It is a compromised survival. He was sick, yes, but illness alone does not explain the shape of his final years. The more important point is that violence kept narrowing his options. Each new episode left him more dependent on the same traits that had carried him this far: hard nerve, dangerous friends, a feared name, and the readiness to use a gun before a physical struggle turned against him. That combination had made him effective in gambling rooms and street confrontations. It also made it hard for him to live any kind of ordinary life afterward. A man can build his safety on intimidation for only so long, before intimidation becomes the whole frame around him.
By the time Holliday reached Colorado, he was carrying not just tuberculosis and a famous name, but the weight of accumulated violence that had pushed him farther from legitimacy than most films care to admit. Even when he was technically out of immediate reach, he was still a man shaped by flight, by unresolved blood, and by the fact that whole territories no longer saw him as just a gambler with bad lungs and sharp wit. Number 12. The Last Gun. One of the strongest arguments that Doc Holliday was worse than the movies show is that the roughness did not end with Tombstone and the vendetta. It followed him into Colorado, into poorer health, into weaker circumstances, and into one more ugly shooting that tends to get overshadowed by the Arizona legend. In Leadville, Holliday got into conflict with a man named Billy Allen. The dispute is often remembered as being over $5, but that summary is too simple. Holliday himself later indicated that the money was only a pretext, and that the real issue was older bad blood. That detail is revealing. It suggests the pattern had not changed. Grievances did not stay small around him. They thickened. They collected history. They became part of a larger story of insult, mistrust, and expected violence.
Accounts around the incident describe threats beforehand, including statements that Holliday might get a shotgun and kill Allen on sight. Then, in August 1884, Allen appeared at Hyman's saloon in Leadville, and Holliday shot him. Allen survived, and Holliday was put on trial. He was acquitted. Once again, the legal result did not erase the underlying shape of the event. This was not a glamorous act from the high period of frontier legend. It was a later, harder scene. A sick, worn man still reaching for armed force in a dispute that had already curdled into fear and threat. Holliday argued that he feared Allen physically and believed he had to act before Allen got hold of him. That defense actually fits the larger pattern we have already seen. Holliday's sickness and thin build did not make him gentle. If anything, they may have made him more likely to rely on weapons the moment he thought a situation might become physical. A healthy brawler could take a punch, wrestle, or back away. Holliday had spent years building a style of survival that jumped quickly toward armed resolution. Leadville shows that the habit did not disappear just because the great Tombstone chapter was over. And this is where movies often do the most flattering work of all. They stop at the point where his legend is brightest. They prefer the version of Doc who exists beside Wyatt Earp in the famous Arizona light, not the later Doc who is still in trouble, still in court, still armed, still ready to make a relatively small dispute into a near killing. But history keeps going after the best scene. The man does not freeze at his most cinematic moment. He keeps living, and the later living tells you what the earlier legend often hides. Holliday was not only dangerous when history handed him an epic feud. He remained dangerous in smaller, meaner settings, where there was no larger cause to rescue his image. By Leadville, the old pattern was stripped almost bare. Old resentment, threat, fear, a saloon, a gun, a trial. No mythic frame was needed. The man himself was enough. Number 13. The Count. At this point, it is worth facing a problem that confuses a lot of people. If modern historians cut down some of the legends around Holliday, does that make him less frightening than the movies? On the surface, maybe it seems that way. A lot of popular culture grew up around the idea that Holliday left a mountain of bodies behind him. Modern research is much more careful. Several killings attributed to him are weakly documented or wrapped in rumor. One famous early killing in New Mexico, the death of Mike Gordon, is not as solid as legend makes it seem.
The coroner's record did not name Holliday, and newspapers at the time did not immediately place the crime on him in the dramatic way later writers did. The supposed final duel with Johnny Ringo does not hold up either, because Ringo's death was officially ruled a suicide. And other stories from the frontier press and later Western writing clearly grew by repetition. So, if the body count legend shrinks, what is left? Quite a lot, actually, and maybe something more unsettling. What is left is not a superhuman killer standing in a cloud of smoke. What is left is a man for whom violence was normal enough, useful enough, and close enough that he kept landing in armed confrontations across different towns and different years. You do not need 10 extra ghost killings to make that disturbing. A confirmed saloon shooting in Tombstone, central participation in the OK Corral fight, a role in the vendetta phase after Morgan Earp's murder, the Tucson station killing in the orbit of that revenge, the later Billy Allen shooting in Leadville. Add the threats, the arrests, the collapsed accusations, the courtroom scrutiny, and the number of times his name appears where law, fear, and gunfire meet, and you get something the movies often miss. The real Holliday may have killed fewer men than legend claims, but he may also have been worse in a more believable way. He was not a mythic death machine. He was a human being who repeatedly chose to live inside systems of intimidation and armed escalation. That kind of man can damage a place, even when he is not constantly adding bodies to the count. He changes how rooms feel. He changes how opponents prepare. He raises the chance that every insult becomes a crisis. In a way, the inflation of his legend has hidden the more important truth. People got so focused on asking whether Doc killed this man or that man that they sometimes miss the pattern right in front of them. The pattern is not fantasy. The pattern is a life organized around the usefulness of fear. Once you understand that, reducing the legend does not clean him up. It just brings him closer, and closer can be worse. Number 14, the edge. That is probably the clearest way to understand why Doc Holliday can feel worse than the movies show, even after you strip away the biggest myths. Movies give him shape. They give him style, fatalism, elegance, and a kind of tragic moral outline. He becomes the sick gunfighter who sees the truth, mocks fools, stands by his friend, and dies before the world can fully tame him. The historical Holliday is harder to package. He could still be witty, still loyal, still impressive under pressure. None of that disappears. But alongside it sits a much rougher set of traits: an unsteady temper, a willingness to provoke, a habit of carrying private hate into public spaces, a practical use of fear as protection, and an ability to make violence seem close even when no legendary showdown was underway. He was not just a man who happened to be present at famous moments in the Wild West. He was one of the reasons those moments became explosive. He helped create the atmosphere that later stories pretend he merely navigated. He could ride beside lawmen and still make townspeople uneasy.
A judge could release him and still call the decision to use him poor judgment. A rival could die in circumstances that turned into legend precisely because Holliday already seemed like the kind of man who might have done it. That is a reputation built not only on storytelling, but on long familiarity with danger. And maybe that is the final difference between the screen version and the real one. Film violence often feels selective, meaningful, almost ceremonial. Holliday's real world was more cramped than that, more petty, more paranoid, more full of half-drunk threats, old resentments, public humiliations, and guns appearing where words had failed.
His illness did not purify him. His intelligence did not civilize him. His friendship with Wyatt Earp did not turn him into a clean hero. If anything, those qualities made the contradiction stronger. He could be sharp enough to read danger, loyal enough to commit himself, and volatile enough to make everything around him more unstable. That is not the profile of a simple villain, but it is also not the profile of the polished anti-hero most people remember. Once the Hollywood dust settles, Doc Holliday looks less like a cool legend and more like one of the most unsettling kinds of Old West figure. A man who knew exactly how useful fear could be, kept violence close because it worked, and left behind a record where even the proven parts are rough enough that the myth hardly needed to exaggerate him at all.